Hello, and welcome to another episode of 28 Days of Blackness. Today, we have the privilege of having with us Educational Gilmore. And today, he'll be educating us on Reconstruction. Frank, tell us a little bit about the Reconstruction period.
Well, Reconstruction was about a 12-year period in which we were trying to reunify the country as a whole, because with the Civil War we witnessed the North versus the South, and it was a very messy situation. So Reconstruction was an initiative put in play to reunify the entire country. That's the North Union and the Confederate States of the South, and that period lasts for about 12 years. President Lincoln was in office for about 2 of those years of the period of Reconstruction.
Oh, wow. And that's definitely great information to have. You know, we're talking about Reconstruction, and you said immediately after the Civil War, so we have to acknowledge that. Didn't the Civil War, wasn't that the war that ended slavery in our country? How were blacks affected?
Whoa. Nothing can be further from the truth. I wouldn't say that was war that ended slavery in our country, but I would say that was a war which we've seen upwards of 200,000 black men and women literally fighting for their rights. 40,000 of which whom have lost their lives. And we did try to implement some legislation and some amendments to at least theoretically protect free blacks.
So, whoa, you said something that was very, very important. You said amendments,
yes,
like the amendments we have in our country.
In fact, we have 3 amendments that are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. It's the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendments. Theoretically, these were some great amendments to protect blacks, but practically this didn't really work, because with the 13th Amendment, for example, we seen that all blacks were essentially free and supposed to have been treated equally as their white counterparts. But we see the effects of the 13th Amendment alive and fresh in 2019, and that essentially was a clause of everyone is free except for crime of punishment. So essentially, everyone is free unless they are doing crime for punishment. Well, anyone can be accused and convicted of a crime, hence the term a jury of your peers was not a jury of black peers.
So, wow, that's definitely interesting to understand. And you brought up amendments. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, the 13th Amendment, while the intent of the 13th Amendment was great, it didn't really offer due process and equal protection under the law. For example, the grandfather clause, right, which seen the literacy clause attached to the grandfather clause, which stated that an individual who was going to vote had to learn or had to be able to read and write. First and foremost, you're talking about a demographic of people who was held in captivity and were forbidden from reading and writing. In fact, they were punished if it was found out that they knew how to read or write. So while we passed this amendment which state that all individuals can vote, and then we have the grandfather clause. Of course, individuals who were of the hierarchy or of the Caucasian descent, they can be grandfathered in because their grandfathers was actually the ones who held us in captivity.
Wow. And then, you know, we start hearing about these laws, and we start hearing about, you know, these amendments. And you're right. Even though these amendments were created in good faith, in order for a law to be effective, even if it's a racist law, it has to be enforced. Who were the enforcers of these grandfather clauses?
Well, the enforcers of these laws were the same people who oppressed us before the laws were implemented. So the enforcers of these laws were essentially Ku Klux Klan members who were elected officials.
So the KKK.
Yes, correct, the KKK.
And you said that they were elected officials, so doesn't that mean that they had a vested interest in voting? How did that affect blacks in the South?
Well, you have to understand the graphic nature in which the Ku Klux Klan operated. they were very strategic with regards to people who they hung, prominent black people who they hung. They didn't just randomly select black people to hang. No, they picked the most powerful, the most intellectual, the one whom we looked up to the most, and displayed them in the public for our consumption to basically show us, listen, this is what happened when you get out of line. So how is that going to encourage me if I'm going to vote and I see my uncle, my aunt, or my leader hanging from a tree?
Oh, wow. And that is, as you stated, that is very, very graphic. And, you know, it's definitely sad. So when we were looking at this, we also do know during this period, you know, it wasn't always the case. You had prominent black figures taking positions in office, you know, and legislation as well, as far as becoming sheriffs and things of that nature. So as a result to this, you're saying pretty much that the Klan was formed and they did a bunch of things to deter blacks from actually thriving.
Yes, essentially the invention of the Ku Klux Klan was to derail or push off pace the black advancement. So we had black elected officials during this period. And the election process always was pretty much the majority, the individual who get the majority of the votes win. So Ku Klux Klan tactics were centered around getting low voter turnouts for those black elected officials or those black elected hopeful officials.
Oh, wow. And what was the result of that? You have blacks no longer being eligible for, you know, positions of authority or positions of power. And what literally happens because of that? We're talking about pretty much the fall of Reconstruction. What takes its place?
We've seen some advancement, some improvement. I wouldn't say it's a glorified period because we witnessed President Andrew Johnson essentially reappoint those Confederate leaders who was appointed when we defeated the Confederate state. So racism was essentially reinventing itself in different shades and different forms. So while we talk about that 12-year period as being the glory period, there still was some harsh treatment of black people going on during this period.
Wait, oh wow. So, you know, Andrew Johnson gets elected at the latter part of the Reconstruction period,
yes.
And he begins to pull out troops from the South.
Yes.
Which pretty much ushers in Jim Crow.
Jim Crow, yes. Well, in the beginning, with the influx of troops essentially forcing the amendments, basically protecting blacks when Lincoln was in office. And then Andrew Johnson come in, he essentially withdraw the troops, bringing the troops. So every year, the number of troops in the South are dwindling. Thus, there's less and less protection for the blacks.
Oh, wow. And the country can't go back into another civil war, so they just turned tail.
Yes, they pretty much just went with the flow, and then you see history kind of repeating itself again. And then, like I said, we talked about Jim Crow, and then we talked about more slavery. So while the slaves were emancipated some years ago, and we went through this process of the Civil War, then Reconstruction, then it's almost like we're back at step one in essence.
So it would be basically safe for me to say that mass incarceration is the bastard child of slavery.
Well, it wouldn't only, it would be, I would argue that it would be more than safe. I would argue that it would be an accurate assumption. Because, like I was talking earlier about the 13th Amendment, and everyone is pretty much free except for the consequence for the punishment of crime. And then you see mass incarceration. You see the parallel. You see the common denominator is essentially keep a group of people impoverished and working for slave wages so that certain individuals of certain ethnical demographics can benefit. Mass incarceration. Who is massively incarcerated? Black and brown people. What is happening to mass incarceration, mass incarcerated individuals? They're working for next to nothing. So the cycle constantly repeats itself.
Oh, wow. Well, this has been a very good lesson about the Reconstruction period.
Yes.
Is there anything, because it's such a, it's an uplifting while also a dark period in this
Yes.
country. Is there anything that we can take from this? How does this help you to, raise awareness in our community as you do?
Well, I mean, this information is extremely insightful in a sense that we can't just be content when legislation is passed. We have to look at the underlying clauses. We have to look at the loopholes in the legislation, because so many times legislation is pushed and passed and then there's loopholes for exploitation of our most vulnerable population. So if there's any takeaways, I would just urge all community leaders and all conscious-minded people to understand that all legislation on the surface may seem good, but rest assured there are loopholes for exploitation of certain demographics.
Well, thank you very much for that, Educational Gilmore. We're just going to have to ask you, before you go, please leave us with a positive word.
Well, I'll leave you with a positive quote, and that quote is, "Knowledge held in its origins is useless." And the reason why I say that knowledge held in its origins is useless, because it does me no good if I have access to valuable information that can help people and I don't deliver that message to them. I don't disseminate that information to them. So on that note, knowledge held in its origins is useless.
Thank you very, very much. And it's been an honor to work with you here today. Stay tuned for another episode of 28 Days of Blackness.